I believe the aim of economics is human flourishing. I don't believe human beings need very many incentives to consume. Production is the part that requires incentive. And I think in production, which is at the essence of supply side economics, is the heart of what we're going for, that mankind finds internal satisfaction in being a producer and is driving economic growth by doing so. Why is that? Because we can't consume until we first produce.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is Homeschool Talks. To find out more about Homeschool Legal Defense Association, you can visit our website at hslda.org. Today, I'm very excited to be talking to my guest, David Bahnsen. David is a money manager and a founding partner of the Bahnsen Group, and I'm going to let David explain more about that himself. You out there in homeschool land may be wondering, why in the world is David Bahnsen, who's a money manager, a big-time money manager, on Homeschool Talks? And I'm going to tell you why. I have been reading David's column in National Review for quite some time, and he talks about economics and money things, capital matters, I think it's called. And I heard him on a podcast recently talking about economics and current events. And towards the end of the podcast, the host asked him a question about the theology of money. And it really intrigued me, and his answer especially intrigued me, because he started out with a sentence that was somewhat surprising to me, and it was something like this: where Milton Friedman and other economists went wrong is by ignoring the human parts of economics, and he began to talk about the theology of economics. David, welcome. With that introduction, I'll let you explain what you do, and then we'll get into some of the things that you've done that are of interest to our audience.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words. I am managing partner of the Bahnsen Group, which, as you said, is a money management firm. We are particularly in private wealth management, so we manage a little over $4 billion on behalf of individuals, families, and a certain degree of churches and institutions. But when I say manage the money, it's a really holistic experience. We're dealing with people's estate planning, tax planning, kind of a full stop service for individuals in need of such. And of course, in that line of work where we're managing all of the money ourselves and doing so at scale for a lot of people, with a lot of dollars involved, it's very important that someone have an economic worldview and have a sort of set of a formation, if you will, around how they view the world and how they view economic activity within the world. And so that's been the great passion of my life now for several decades, many and several more decades to come.
So you recently came out with a book called There's No Free Lunch. Tell us what that's about and what prompted you to write that.
I am of the opinion right now that one of the great needs of the hour is economic education, economic worldview that is rooted to something. I say this with a certain degree of optimism or encouragement, and that is that for the most part, Americans at large, it varies by age group, but Americans at large have a largely favorable view of free enterprise. I think that the impulse that is connected to the American DNA is generally favorable to the idea of a market economy, to the way in which market economy distributes risk and reward, that most Americans generally have a positive impression of the results that such an economic system can create. It is true that at a younger adult audience, anywhere from age 18 to 30, those numbers are skewing more the other way. But I believe that has more to do with misunderstanding as to what free enterprise really is, as opposed to a thoroughly researched conclusion that socialism or progressivism or collectivism are superior economic ideologies. So why would I need to write a book then if we, for the most part, are already a pretty good free enterprise nation? Because I believe that our free enterprise affinity is largely an impulse. That we're not exactly sure why we believe it. We've seen it empirically do pretty well. There's something intuitively that seems to make sense about it. I feel very strongly it's not going to work. I want desperately, including starting at a very young age, for people to connect what they believe about human interaction, the social dynamic that we call economics. I want them to root that to a worldview, to have an actual firm foundation so that in the years and decades ahead, where I believe a commitment to a market economy and free enterprise is going to be vigorously tested, I want us to be up for the task. And I do not believe we're equipped for it now. And so my intention is to try to offer greater economic education that is rooted in first principles.
So the book is sort of a daily devotional, bite-sized chunks, kind of laying the groundwork for economic principles, time-tested economic principles. How did you choose that format? I know you've written other books as well, but it's an interesting format.
Well, I wrestled with what the right format would be, but I believe there is a kind of broad market right now for, you see from the popularity of Twitter and other blogs and other mediums that are more bite-sized, as you say. I think that there are great books out there that are more systematic apologetics for free markets. But I think having something that is just day by day enabled me to go to a lot of different topics and to leverage the incredible work of the masters, of the great people whose shoulders we stand on, and yet on a day-by-day basis add my own commentary and add my own kind of elaboration of those principles and lessons we're talking about. And so in a sense, it did become kind of an economic devotional. And I think it was a great way to at least introduce people to a lot of the basic concepts and invite them into perhaps additional inquiry.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I may have done that earlier when I was listening to the podcast and you kind of got over from the current events talking about economic matters in the news, and you kind of transitioned over into the worldview that you ground your economic viewpoints into. I believe I heard you say where Milton Friedman and others went wrong. Did I hear that right?
Yes, I did. I have talked about that so many times, I can't imagine that you didn't hear it. It is
Okay.
certainly something that I believe, but I think it's important to fine-tune what I'm getting at. It is an error of omission, and it was not merely singling out Milton Friedman, whom I adore as an economist and have learned a great deal from. But sadly enough for myself as a committed Christian and someone who wants to apply a Christian worldview to the way in which I interpret matters of public policy, political ethics, economics, the social sciences, human behavior, I want to interpret these things and understand them through the prism of what I believe about the world. And yet in the field of economics, the great champions of 20th century market economics were Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Milton Friedman, who all three were effectively atheists and certainly secular rationalists. They were devoid of these premises. that led to, in my formation of an economic worldview, lead to a lot of great conclusions that Friedman and Hayek and von Mises would largely share, but they didn't root them into the same foundation. And I remain at a total loss as to why, let's call it 250 years after the advent of classical economics, for many years, there was not a systematic discipline known as economics. There were contributions throughout history from Plato and Aristotle, and particularly Augustine, and into the scholastic era. Thomas Aquinas is well known. But really until the Enlightenment and certain moral philosophers like Adam Smith began systematizing a lot of this, we didn't really have a discipline. We call it economics. Well, we have it now. It's been around 250 years. It was a bedrock of a lot of America's founding. And yet most of the great contributions, particularly post-Marxism, have come from men and women not of faith. So while I will always appreciate the great work of Milton Friedman and others, I believe it's important that we root the belief in social organization, social cooperation, and human liberty, root it to a more transcendent force. That's what I'm attempting to do.
So I want to tie in why I, a homeschool lawyer, would especially want you on my podcast. And when I first reached out to you, because I'm just fascinated, but I love Milton Friedman. I cut my teeth on Milton Friedman just like everybody else. I'm not an economist by any stretch, but the free to choose, which you have, kind of the no free lunch, all those sort of things that Hayek and Milton Friedman have written about are very intriguing and interesting to me. But when I first reached out to you, I learned that this new book of yours, No Free Lunch, isn't the only endeavor that you have launched recently. And this new endeavor that you have launched, I think, would be of particular interest to a homeschooling family that wants to understand economics from the worldview of a committed Christian. So what is this new endeavor that you have recently launched?
So at Bahnsen.com, it's just my last name, BAHNSEN.com, we have incubated a full semester-long course in this basic introduction to economics that I'm talking about. I designed the program with upperclassmen in high school in mind, but I'm quite certain that very many eighth graders in the homeschool community would be able to digest the information. And I'm also certain that there are plenty of adults, parents, grandparents that are of a perfectly advanced intellectual acumen that will still find the information quite robust. It is, in my mind, intended for people that want to put that foundation in place around economics that I'm talking about. It's 30 lectures. It's available entirely for free, no cost at all, with a full interactive syllabus that includes links to all the reading and video watching and whatnot. But it's meant to be, again, a survey in Economics 101. And to come out of it with an introduction to first principles, to the proper definitions and vocabulary of economics, starting with what is economics? What is an economy? What do we mean when we use terms like human flourishing? Going through the basic first principles that are necessary to properly understand this subject. But then a full unit into economics in the human person, economics and society, economic schools of thought throughout history. We go through some of these phases that I talked about a moment ago, from the old days of Plato and Aristotle through the patricians and the scholastics into the classical era, Marxism, Keynesianism, Austrianism, a lot of the 20th century schools of thought, Milton Friedman's monetarism, the supply side movement. So we give an overview of all these schools of thought. And I think it's important to identify the distinctives that belong into what economic position or category. But I think we live in an era that's very polarized politically. And I think too many people get their economics from their politics. And what I want is for people to actually have the ability to assess public policy and which is effectively their political opinions on an issue or a candidate or whatnot, a proposition, and do so from an economic worldview, not vice versa. And I think that the class is faithful to that aim, and hopefully people get a lot out of it. I can tell you, of the over 3,000 people that enrolled in the first 5 days in the class, about 70% were homeschool parents and students that were wanting to bring in that information for their own orbit. And of course, they then have the ability to process it and apply it and utilize it in a more flexible manner, which of course is one of the great advantages to the homeschool apparatus. And so I'm really happy about it. I candidly don't believe that there is a lot of great programs or information available for such a thing in either the homeschool or classical school or Christian school community. There is material out there, but I don't think it is scratching all the itches I was attempting to scratch. I'm sure I can find plenty of things I wish I would have done differently or improved upon in my own lectures and material, but I do feel comfortable that the content is what is the need of the hour in the homeschool world.
So you talk a lot and write a lot about human flourishing. How do you get there from talking about, supply side and all of the economic principles that you talk about? Where does human flourishing fit in that?
Well, there's a chicken or egg thing here. I don't get to human flourishing from talking about supply side. I get to supply side from talking about human flourishing. I believe the aim of economics is human flourishing. And I mean human flourishing to be a both material and spiritual abundance, joy, peace, and harmony that comes from people acting in the human dimension, which of course the human dimension involves individual and social, because we were made to be both individuals and to transact in a society. And the flourishing that can come from that to me is two-dimensional between the physical realm and the spiritual realm, leads me to ask questions like, what drives this human fulfillment in activity? Is it consumption or production? I don't think supply-side economics is about lower tax rates. I think lower tax rates help feed the objective of supply-side economics, which is the focus on production, not consumption, and driving economic growth. It comes down to a belief in incentives. I don't believe human beings need very many incentives to consume. I think we know what we like, we know our appetites, our taste, and generally speaking, it's not really that difficult to challenge somebody to enjoy a vacation or a great meal or a great, physical blessing that can be consumed. That part's easy. Production is the part that requires incentive. And I think in production, which is at the essence of supply side economics, is the heart of what we're going for, that mankind finds internal satisfaction in being a producer and is driving economic growth by doing so. Why is that? Because we can't consume until we first produce, and we can't consume until someone else first produces. They have to be making the thing that we're consuming, and we have to produce in order to have the means to enjoy what they're consuming. So you get this virtuous cycle that starts with really the existential, that God made us to be productive. He made us out of the Garden of Eden to have a productive capacity. I don't think people talk about supply side economics this way, but that's all it really is. The application ends up being more tax rates and deregulation and other things like that. But I start with human flourishing as my objective, and it leads me to certain applications in the supply side realm.
And you often start with God made us for a purpose, and that virtuous cycle. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I think that it's one of the most pivotal foundational beliefs that not all people who share an affinity for a market economy agree with. But I believe that I cannot defend a market economy as faithfully and vigorously and passionately as I want to, if I don't start with the very purpose, as you say, of what God made man for. What is our purpose? What is our telos? And when you go back to the very creation account, I think it is abundantly clear that God made mankind with his image, to be image bearers of him, and that he impugned to mankind a special dignity that transcended what he made the animal kingdom with and the plant kingdom with. That mankind possesses a special dignity, and through that shares some of the very characteristics of God himself. We become co-creators with God when he asked us to steward the earth, to care for the earth, to bring its potential out of the creation that God made. And God himself was very innovative and creative and productive. He worked 6 days, rested the seventh. We see a model in the creation account for our very existence here on earth. And I think this becomes a formative way of understanding human action and economics.
So a high school aged homeschool kid who sits through your 30 sessions, they're going to get a good education in economics, historical and current views. But it sounds like they're going to get more than that. Was that was your purpose? And what do you tell a homeschool parent out there for why their kid should take your 30-week course?
Well, I really believe that they're going to learn things, whether it's in a college experience or just in a professional work experience and engagement in society throughout their lives. Today's young people will at some point be exposed to all sorts of errant thinking. And I don't think that our emotions or a nostalgic appeal, a patriotic, rambling is going to be enough. Now, I have a fondness for patriotism and for nostalgia and for the kind of emotional impulse of capitalism. All of those things I possess, but I don't think they're adequate to win the intellectual debate. To win the intellectual debate, we have to arm people with why we believe what we believe. The big criticism of markets is that that they're Darwinian, that they reward people who have sharp elbows. But of course, if we understand the concept of a free and virtuous economy, markets ought to be rewarding people who meet the needs of humanity. No entrepreneur can get paid without making a good or service that somebody else wants. And they want it because it's helping advance their own quality of life. So by framing economics in the construct that there is an inadequacy of a central planner taking over more control of the economic domain, and that we ourselves are sufficient to meet the needs of one another and to scale this endeavor throughout civilization, to study the history of how this has played out and provide that kind of foundation as to what the ideal and optimal recipe for social organization is. I want people learning this at 5 years old, let alone 15, 17, 19, going into college. I think what you're going to see is if we take economic education seriously, that we are going to have it really bear fruit in the business realm, in the marketplace, in the universities, in the political dimension, that there are so many applications that unfortunately people who I think have errant economic thinking have had a monopoly really for almost 100 years now. And so this is kind of the aim I have. I will, wherever I can, borrow from the great work that von Mises and others have done, but I don't think their secular rationalism squares the entire circle. I think that for us to go the full way with this, we must build that foundation on a much more solid ground. And there are, fortunately, great teachings in Scripture and great other mentors that have done great work here, champions of economic thought that need to be brought to homeschool kids and others.
What prompted you to do this? I mean, this sounds like a big work to put together 30 classes, and I've gone through the website, and there's a lot of great resources. Now I can imagine any number of ways that it could be used in a classroom or with a homeschool, just an individual going through it, a lifelong learner going through it. I mean, it's great material. But you did it for free. That's not, what kind of market economist are you?
Well, let's be honest here. It is hardly going to be my day job, even if I didn't do it for free. It was a very strong belief of mine that I preferred a wider audience with no revenue versus a smaller audience where maybe some of the costs and expenses could be recouped. It's a labor of love. I don't want to sound like a martyr here, but I don't need the money, and I do need this message to be more broadly promoted. It's something I believe in a great deal. I have a studio where in my office already, and we were able to hire the right people, editors and so forth, that are already kind of involved in my organization. And so we utilized, again, back to economic principles, our own division of labor, design team, web. My business has plenty of tentacles to various forms of digital media. And so we were able to put it together. The content creation and the course organization was the hardest part, but I had designed the course for the lectures I gave in real life at a small Christian high school in Southern California that I was a part of founding. And so we didn't record those lectures live. I allowed those to kind of be a dress rehearsal, and I turned some knobs on the content a little to see what worked and what didn't, and what sequence and flow I thought maybe could be improved upon. And then we used the studio to go record it all. So I'm quite certain that the decision to put it out for free was the right one, and that ultimately it will end up bearing more fruit as I think it animates people to ongoing human action. It's the story of human nature.
Yeah, and I say that, jokingly, of course, because it's just a tremendous resource. And, here at Homeschool Legal Defense Association, we love to promote these kind of resources to homeschool families, because a lot of homeschool families, they're educating their children on a pretty tight budget. Yeah. And so when you get really high quality content like this with no cost, it's a pretty big deal in my world and in the homeschooling world. So I just want to say thank you for doing it, first of all. I have a related question, and we haven't talked about this, but central planning is not a thing that you would support in the economic world. What do you think about central planning in the education world? And is there a corollary to the way you think about market economy to education?
Well, there definitely is. One of the great themes of those who oppose central planning is a focus on decentralized planning, on spontaneous order, and on the concept of subsidiarity. And so because I believe that Friedrich Hayek talked about it in terms of the knowledge problem, that knowledge is dispersed in society in such a way that a great big central actor far removed from what is actually going on in time and place circumstances is unable and certainly least qualified to be a decision maker in that realm. I actually can't think of very many things where that applies to more than education. And so even those who favor a robust public school system, if they're being intellectually honest, would acknowledge that at their local school board, they're likely to get a better result than out of Washington, D.C. And so I think the failure of central planning is incredibly evident in how miserable the results have been from the Department of Education, wholly unnecessary central planner in the idea of education. So basic market principles at play with localism, with people who are most connected to the results. One of the great selling points of the homeschool movement has always been that nobody cares about the children. And when I say cares about, I mean loves, has a real love for the children. Even when a teacher says, I love the kids, I think there's a lot of teachers that are really loving human beings that pour into that mission, but they shouldn't and pretty much can't love the kids the way a parent can because of the nature of that relationship, the dynamic itself being different. So I very much believe that there is, at principle in education, a favoritism for decentralization.
So the homeschool movement, a lot of people think that homeschooling is just a mom sitting at the kitchen table teaching a kid, but the movement really is quite phenomenal when you think about it, that, homeschool families band together in ways that are important to themselves, that no one makes them do, no state government dictates to them. They form these amazing things that de Tocqueville talked about, private associations that are kind of unique to the American DNA, in ways that I think it could go underappreciated. So the homeschooling movement, you talk about the knowledge problem. Nobody built the homeschool movement. There was no Department of Home Education saying this is how homeschooling will be done. It sprang up organically as people made free choices together.
Yes.
And what I really like about your work and the way you talk about things is parents who choose to homeschool do it so their children can flourish.
Yes.
And so there's an essay I'm sure you're familiar with that I like to think about and talk about. I pencil.
Oh yeah, it's in the curriculum.
Yeah, okay, good. So tell people what that's about and how in the world does that relate to both your topic and my homeschooling world?
Well, in the 30-second version, Leonard Reed wrote a piece over 70 years ago now, 60 or 70 years ago, pointing out that a pencil, which I think we can buy for 3 or 4 cents, would really cost about $1.5 million to go make on its own. That the division of labor, the specialization, the free exchange, all harnessing from the transportation to the trucking to the lumber and forestry and the complexity that goes into it, we end up with this little 3-cent pencil we use, and yet it's all a byproduct of the miracles of a market economy. That's my 30-second summary of the genius work, I Pencil by Leonard Reed.
In the homeschooling world, that's always suggested to me that, the bureaucratic, top-down, central planned education world is enormously expensive. But homeschool families can do a really good job educating their children and helping them to flourish as human beings and participate in the virtuous cycle of life for, a lot less. Yeah. I mean, enormously a lot less. Well, so give us, where can we find your curriculum? And if you have any final words for a homeschooling audience, I'd appreciate them.
Of course. Again, Bahnsen.com is where this free course is made available. BAHNSEN.com. I wish it was an easier spelling, but it's great for Google search, bad for just quickly laying out the name on a podcast. Bahnsen.com, you'll go there, you'll see economics course right up on the main bar. You just enter your name and email and how you found us and some things like that. And all of a sudden you'll get your login and have access to all 30 of the lectures that are embedded right there on the site, the syllabus, the quizzes, the essay prompts, the final exam. There's a way to get the answer key for it all. It's all pretty well self-contained and provided. The syllabus, there are various articles and white papers and YouTube videos that go along with each course and each unit, and they're all provided with a hot link in the actual PDF of the syllabus. So we did our best to make it as self-contained as possible. And my main argument for why I want homeschoolers in particular to adopt it is, unlike mathematics and reading and creative writing and various sciences, the homeschool community has been able to create and adopt an unbelievable volume of great material in those core subjects for the last 40, 50 years. I just simply don't believe that that exists in the world of economics. And so for the homeschool community to ignore the subject would be, to me, implying that it isn't as important. And I disagree with that. I think it is. So then the question is, well, how do we go about getting the material? Where do we go to get an economic foundation? And I think this is one possible solution. I'm sure there are others out there as well, particularly in a more written form, but I think this is a really good solution. And especially for homeschool families that are somewhat sympathetic to the Christian faith, this is explicitly rooted in a Christian anthropology.
Well, I find it intriguing, fascinating, and I'm really delighted that you would join us today. If people want to read some of your more current works, I think you appear regularly at National Review in the Capital Matters section. Have you written anything recently?
Yeah, so I host a weekly podcast at National Review called Capitol Record. I'm on Fox News at least 3 or 4 times a week, and other, TV financial media. And so from Bunsen.com, the video clips and the podcast and the writings are all there. And it certainly gives people a kind of hub if they're interested in staying in touch. I'd love to do it. Well,
thanks again. David Bahnsen, my guest today. Go check out that curriculum I have, and I think you'll really find it to be useful for your children's education in the homeschool world. And I'm Jim Mason with Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and you can find out more about us at hslda.org. David, thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's Online Academy. When you're homeschooling a high schooler, it can be difficult to stay on top of everything they're learning. The good news is you don't have to do it all on your own. HSLDA Online Academy offers more than 40 live, interactive online courses for grades 7 through 12. And if you're an HSLDA member, you can save up to $125 per course. To view a list of course offerings, visit academy.hslda.org. That's academy.hslda.org. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.